some really good questions. I love it whenever I get good questions. It tells me you're understanding what I'm saying, you understand the implications of what I'm saying, and you're thinking through the kind of things that we're trying to grapple with in creation science to answer some of the big questions. And some real good questions. All right. This one may be my favorite of all the sessions. This one's just really cool to talk about what happened in the flood. Also kind of humbling to learn about what happened in the flood, whenever you understand the extent of it. As a scientist, it's exciting, but as a human, it's really scary. All right. All right, let's jump ahead here. Okay, so moving up to the flood. From the time when men were calling on the name of the Lord early on, the text says. So if you look back at Genesis 4:26, men start calling on the name of the Lord. You've got Seth and Enosh there. Well, from that time to now when we're moving up to the flood, things changed a lot. The reason for the flood, given in the text, is that every intention or intent of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. That's a hard thing to even visualize, that every intention is only evil continually. The cause of that wicked state, interestingly, is given in the first two verses there, chapter 6. The sons of God, this is the good people, they're following God, those who were calling on the name of the Lord, began to notice beauty more and make that more of a priority in their marital decisions. And so the good people began marrying the daughters of men, the worldly people, based on physical beauty rather than apparently spiritual beauty, which was more important for them. So some argue that the sons of men here were angels who married humans. But that doesn't work because Jesus indicates in Matthew 22:30 that the angels are not apparently capable of such unions. So instead, the expression sons of God can sometimes mean angels, but you have to look at the context. In this case, sons of God, daughters of men are idioms referring to the good people, those who just a few verses before were those that were calling on the name of the Lord there in Seth's lineage in chapter 4, verse 26, marrying the bad people, generally assumed to be the descendants of Cain. So keep in mind that the original book of Genesis, of course, did not have these chapter breaks. So contextually, it would make sense if the sons of God is a reference to those that were just discussed prior to that, the ones who were calling on the name of the Lord. We also notice from chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, that God saw violence filling the earth, and that all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth, it says. So most commentators immediately assume that that phrase, all flesh, is referring just to humans. So just referring to the moral state of man had become corrupted. But it's also true that in the same context, all flesh can be used to refer to the animals at times as well. If that is the meaning in Genesis 6, there in verses 11 and 12, then it could be referring to a change that had occurred over time in the nature of the animal kingdom as well. So not that they had become morally depraved or something, but their very nature had been corrupted from what had originally been created to be. So either due to how humans interacted with them or possibly due to gradual deterioration genetically. So if so, then the violence that God apparently saw on the earth could have included the animal kingdom as well, which would explain why you see on the dinosaur fossils from the flood, you see evidence of dinosaurs attacking each other. Like T-Rex, for example, you see evidence of T-Rex violence towards each other, for example. And that was probably not initially part of how things were back in the very beginning, considering again that God initially created animals to be herbivores. So notice also the phrase, his days shall be 120 years, there in verse 3. So some will take that to mean that God was setting up a limit as to how long humans could live from then on, as though he was punishing them with a young age now, so that he wouldn't be able to live very long anymore, 120 years max. Now, I don't see that working for at least a few reasons. Number one, Albert Barnes in his commentary makes the point that man in this verse is referring to the single race of man as a whole, rather than the plurality of individuals making up the human race. So the 120 years would seem to be referring to the life of the race of man as a whole. So the whole race is going to die in 120 years. He says that he thinks that's what it's talking about. Number two, man kept living beyond 120 years for centuries after that statement was made. And number three, it would be strange to arbitrarily select 120 as a punishment for the upper limit of your life longevity, and deem that to be a punishment for wickedness. Number four, the point of this whole section, contextually, is to show how God was going to punish the world through the flood. So the punishment being referred to with the 120 years seems to have to be related to that idea. So it makes more sense contextually to be saying, man is wicked, I'm not going to put up with it forever. My spirit won't strive with man forever, the text says. I'm going to reach a breaking point. In fact, you've got 120 years to change your minds. So Noah, get to work. And so incidentally, when you look closely at the text, we see that Noah was 500 years old when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born. And he was 600 when the flood came, and so that's not 120 years. So what I get from that is that in whenever that statement's made, in verse 3, that was made during the genealogies of Genesis 5 before that verse. So God apparently made the decision to bring about the flood some 20 years before Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born, is what's going on there. So God instructs Noah to build a boat. It says 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. And according to scholars, I would translate to a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall. And so he's told to make the ark out of this unknown wood called gopher wood, make 3 decks on it, and have rooms for the animals, and cover it with pitch, apparently so it wouldn't leak, and put a door in the side of it. And God tells him to install this opening. It's not exactly a window as we usually think of it in Bible class, but according to the underlying Hebrew, this is an opening for probably light and possibly ventilation that apparently went around the top of the vessel and was a cubit in height. And according to chapter 8, verse 13, a covering or awning of some sort was put over the opening as well, which was left until the end of the torrential rains. And then Noah opened this window-like structure to see the state of things. God apparently brought or sent the animals that he wanted on the ark to Noah. Noah didn't have to go hunt for those. And a male and female representative of the unclean kinds. And according to chapter 7, 7 representatives of the clean kinds of animals. Whether that's 7 individuals or 7 pairs is unclear. So again, these are representatives of the kinds, not species. So keep that in mind. Animals from the earth, including birds and creeping things, which would have probably included various reptiles and possibly some amphibians, as well as maybe some insects and worms. Noah also brings food for his family and the animals. And so after loading them all up, God himself shuts the door, and then, so to speak, the fireworks began. And that, of course, brings us right up to the actual event. And remember, the works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. That's what we're doing here, looking at. One of the greatest works that God has ever worked on this earth is this event that happened. So the Bible only gives us a few details about this event. You know, it occurred 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. It was global in its extent. It covered everything. The fountains of the deep were broken up, and water came down from above. The mountains rose, the valleys sank, and it lasted essentially a year. That's about it. It's not really a lot to work with. So when you look up from the text and you actually look at the earth and we begin to study the evidence from that event, looking for evidence of it, we have to go to reconcile then what we see in the physical evidence from the earth with what we see in Scripture, put it together, and it can often give you a much bigger picture of what happened. And so we ask the question, what can we learn further about what happened in the flood? And does the evidence from geology fit with Scripture? All right, this is a video a depiction of the flood, what modern Christian scientists believe happened during the first few hours of the flood. All right. We pulled a picture. All right, so let's get into the details of why that's the thinking. All right, so as I mentioned before, modern creation science theorizes that much of the water in the flood came from the oceans and from below the earth rather than above, which was what was once thought. But keep in mind that it's also incorrect to think of the flood as only involving water and rain, for example. So the flood was a major geologic event. The earth was apparently totally restructured. The phrase, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, is significant. The great deep referring to the depths of the ocean. So we're talking about the breakup of the ocean floor. Proverbs 3:20 mentions that as well, stating that the depths were broken up. Psalm 104, 6-9 seems to be referring to the flood in light of verse 9. I'll talk about that more in a few moments. But assuming this is referring to the flood, notice that it says that in the flood, the mountains rose, the valleys sank, creating a boundary so that the waters of the flood couldn't again cover the earth. So the flood was a major geologic event. We're not just talking about water here. Now, the order of events mentioned in Genesis 7 is noteworthy to creation scientists. So the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and then it says the rains came. So what exactly initiated this chain of events is unclear. Did God miraculously, directly just initiate the eruption of the fountains of the great deep? Did he use some external physical entity like a massive meteorite? There's a lot of physical evidence in the geologic layers that meteorites struck during the flood. So regardless, creation geologists have tried to piece together what happened after that point that it began, based on what we understand about geology today. So geologists have determined that the interior of the earth is comprised of a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mantle of predominantly solid rock, although the upper part has some plasticity, and then we have the crust upon which we live. Now, looking at the surface, geologists have discovered that the surface of the earth is broken up into plates that move around relative to each other. Today, they're moving on the order of centimeters per year, so basically as fast as your fingernails grow. And so the earth is like this cracked egg, and the earth is unique in that. The earth is the only planet known to have these plates. And creation geologists believe that the cracking of the egg might have occurred at the initiation of the flood. So the model that describes the motion of these plates and the effects of that motion is called plate tectonics. And most geologic activity on the earth occurs along the margins of these plates as they move. And so you've got earthquakes and volcanoes and mountain building. And as these plates move relative to one another, different things happen. Some subduct. So you see that going on here. Some subduct. So one plate goes under another, diving into the mantle. And some will diverge, and so they move apart. and new material from the mantle comes up into the gap. All right, so that's a divergent type movement. Some converge, so they smash into each other, and so they're making mountains, right? Mountain building is extremely slow since the plates, go back here. So mountain building is extremely slow since the plates are moving so slow. So it would take eons at today's rates to form those mountains. So if that's happening, then how can creationists explain that evidence? How can that be harmonized with Scripture? All right, so from the movement of these plates, geologists are able to extrapolate backwards to get an idea of the past. And so plate tectonic theory is able to explain a lot of things. Why the continents appear to fit together like a puzzle, why there's matching rock layers and mountain belts on different continents that are separated by water now, but that fit together even though they're separated by oceans. You got mountain ranges that do that. It explains why there's matching fossil distributions across these puzzle pieces of the continents that are now separated, and several other things. So it has great explanatory power, but as usual, modern naturalistic theories are based on erroneous assumptions, in this case, uniformitarianism. So the idea that whatever's going on today, whatever's going on today, it must have always gone on that way. So whatever rates of movement you see going on today, it must have always been that way. And so cataclysmic events which you can't witness today must have never happened, because they don't happen today. So if the continents are moving apart centimeters per year today, they must have always moved that slow, and therefore it must have taken eons for those continents to fit together like this. All right, now, but we've already seen the Bible's known to be inspired. It's a true account of history. So that means the flood occurred, which means that uniformitarianism is not right. You must take into account major catastrophic activity from the past. So the effects of global catastrophes in the past have to be considered if they play a major role in plate movement. So using the actual evidence from modern geology and plate tectonics, but removing the hidden assumption of uniformitarianism, creation geologists have developed our own theory called catastrophic plate tectonics. This is called CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics. A young Earth creation geophysicist by the name of John Baumgartner laid the groundwork for this model when he developed a supercomputer program while he was at UCLA doing his doctoral research in geophysics and space physics. This program he developed, called Terra, helps to model the dynamics of the Earth's interior. And based upon the predictions of that program, other creation physicists and geologists have joined in developing CPT to describe what likely was happening during the flood. So significantly paraphrasing the model, before the flood, the plates didn't exist and the continents were not separated. And at the outset of the flood, the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Genesis 7:11, the plates broke apart. Understanding that the fountains of the deep there wouldn't necessarily be solely water. This is including magma from beneath the earth. So according to this model, something caused the breakup of that cold, dense ocean floor, breaking it into several pieces, including breaking the ocean plate away from the continental plates. So according to computer simulations, when that break at the boundaries between the plates and the oceanic plate occurred, there would have been what's called thermal runaway subduction of the seafloor afterwards. So instead of the creeping rate at which plates are moving in the mantle, into the mantle today, at the beginning of the flood, the seafloor was basically diving into the mantle. In 1994, when CPT was being developed, creation scientists predicted that if this is true, that the mantle was essentially overturned like a conveyor belt. So there should be evidence of colder material still in the mantle, because it only happened a few thousand years ago. See, if uniformitarian plate tectonics is true, then this process has always gone on extremely slowly. So there should have been plenty of time for any of the material down there in the ocean floor to heat up before it got very deep into the mantle. So in other words, there shouldn't be enormous piles of cold material in the mantle. Well, sure enough, 3 years after this prediction, seismic images became available of the mantle's density structure, and it verified the prediction and showed that there's evidence of enormous piles of cooler slabs of material in the mantle, specifically under these subduction zones, right where they should be if we're right. So apparently remnants of the pre-flood ocean crust that just piled up onto the mantle. So this rapid diving would have caused the plates to move rapidly. Instead of centimeters per year, they're moving at meters per second, if you can visualize that. So in other words, a supercontinent breaks up and starts moving apart rapidly. That would have caused the rapid formation of mountains along subduction zones and, of course, convergence zones as materials are piled up as plates dove or slammed into each other. And so you picture this conveyor belt with the cold crust of the ocean floor diving into the mantle and hot material coming up, replacing that onto the ocean floor. That extra hot magma hitting the cold ocean water would have sent steam jettisoned into the atmosphere like was shown in that video. And that magma would have been coming up all along those divergent zones all over the earth, under the ocean, most of which again are in the ocean. So this would have caused intense rain around the globe for a long period of time as these geysers that stretched for hundreds of miles all over the earth are erupting and pumping water high up into the atmosphere, and that water then will come back down from the heavens onto the land. And so the added magma to the sea floor would have displaced water from the seas onto the land. So it essentially raised the ocean floor. The hot material replacing the colder material on the ocean floor would have been less dense because it's hotter and therefore it's lighter. And so it's essentially the ocean floor is floating higher in the mantle. It pushes the sea floor up. Creation physicists and geologists believe 3,500 feet higher than regular. So as the sea floor is raised, water from the seas is dumping onto the land. It's carrying sea creatures with it, which explains why there's so many marine animals all over the planet, even on dry land and even on the mountains. And so water is coming up from the ocean as the sea level rises. In addition to the water coming down from these immense geysers, tsunamis are rocking the land due to this major tectonic activity under the ocean. So most of the water from the flood is coming from the oceans through evaporation and rain, and primarily from the sea level rising. And so this process would have gradually slowed as the ocean floor temperature gradually cooled back down, slowing the plate movements back down, stopping the steam jets, lowering the sea floor again, and allowing the floodwaters to return to the sea. So let's look a little bit closer at Psalm 104 here. You covered it, the earth, with the deep, as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Now, commentators are divided as to whether this passage is referring just to the creation week, so day 3, as God is creating dry land, rather than speaking of the flood. But in light of verse 9 there, that seems doubtful to me. The earth was covered with water, verse 6. Then things happened that caused a boundary to form that would make it where the earth could never again be covered by water. So if this passage is referring just to the creation week, then this verse is false, because it was violated in the flood. Water did in fact cover the earth again in the flood, unlike what that passage says. Now, if it refers to the flood, then it makes perfect sense, because the modern creation model would say that the high mountains were formed during the flood, when these plates are smashing into each other at these convergence and subduction zones. So due to the formation of the mountains in the flood, it is now impossible for there to be enough water to completely submerge the earth again, just like this passage indicates. So by the mountains rising and the valleys sinking, a boundary was set for the water that might not again cover the earth. So if this is referring to the flood, it would imply that the mountains of the pre-flood world were not as high. The earth was more flat, though there were still something like mountains, possibly high hills, alluded to in chapter 7, verse 19. So the implication is that covering all the high hills of the pre-flood world wouldn't have required the same amount of water as it would today, because we have extremely high mountains now due to that activity in the flood. So Mount Everest, for example, might not have been what it is today. So some have argued that the flood could not have been global, because they said there just wasn't enough water for it. If the flood happened, where did all the water come from for it? Where's the water that would have been required to cover the entire planet all the way up over these huge mountains? There's just not enough water in the sky or in the oceans or whatever to do that. So it seems unrealistic to many that the earth possibly could have been completely flooded. And so those who still wish to believe in the Bible argue, well, this must have been a local catastrophe, not global. But that argument can't be sustained in light of Scripture. Catastrophic plate tectonic theory again gives the answer to these problems. CPT theory would say that the water came from the seas, both in the form of rain from these geysers and in the form of the sea level being raised. It would have been nearly as hard to cover the land with water at that point, because the tall mountains would have even been formed until later in the flood, when that recession had begun, and that's after the halfway point. So we got a picture of flatter Earth, one with a lower elevation, covering the highest points by day 40 would require anywhere near the amount of water it would require today. So where did the water go? Well, remember, the raising of the ocean floor and these intense geysers from the fountains would have dumped loads of sediment onto the continents. That, number one, would have raised the level of the continents relative to pre-flood times. Mountains would have formed at the convergence and subducting plate boundaries, raising the land in those areas even further. So without the water going anywhere, the continents are already higher in elevation, making them stick out further. But then we have to consider that much of the water then receded back to the ocean from where it came, because the sea floor gradually cooled, because it was more dense again, and therefore it sank, sitting lower in the mantle, lowering the level of the oceans again. So the last place that waters from the flood would have settled could have been at the poles during the ice advance, which I'll talk about in a few moments. So there's no problem from science in explaining where the water for a global flood would have come from. Now, outside of science, the Bible also doesn't leave room for that local flood idea. If it was a local flood, why in the world would you build an ark over 100 years or so? Why not just leave the area? And why bring animals from all over the place if this was local? Bringing representatives of every living thing. And why do that if it's local? Since God actually brought the animals to Noah anyway, why not just send them out of the area? Why make this ark? And how would the ark be able to stay afloat for several months if this is just a local flood? How could the biblical terminology that describes the water as covering the high mountains that were under the whole of heavens be describing a local flood? How would water even get high enough locally to cover mountains if the flood wasn't greater in its extent? How could the biblical stated purpose of wiping man from the face of the earth be accomplished with a local flood? If the flood was local, then God lied when he promised never to destroy the earth again like that in the way he did. So he's talking about a local flood. Well, local floods occur all the time, but not global floods. Also, Peter used the universal destruction of the earth in the flood to describe what Judgment Day is going to be like. So if the flood wasn't universal, then logically, judgment won't be universal. There was a great point made by a camper at our AP camp last summer. Why did the dove find no resting place for the sole of her foot if this was just a localized flood? The Bible simply doesn't leave room for the local flood interpretation. Either the Bible's right and there was a global flood, or not. And there's no reason to question the Bible's claim that there was a global flood scientifically. We've really got the model laid out pretty well now with the evidence. So according to the text, the rain itself continued for 40 uninterrupted days and nights, but that wasn't the extent of this catastrophe. The waters apparently continued to rise for some time after that. And according to CPT, that would be due to the fountains of the deep continuing to disperse lava and possibly water from beneath the earth, displacing the seas onto the land. And so the rising waters eventually leveled out and apparently then began to decrease on the 150th day, so 5 months from the beginning of the flood. The water was 15 cubits, about 23 feet above the mountains apparently, allowing for the draw to the ark, so the ark didn't scrape the tops of the mountains. The ark was 30 cubits, so it would have had a draught of about 15 cubits, about half its height, and so its weight would have caused half of it to be submerged, and so that was not a problem. The water was so high. Notice that during this catastrophic period, typical Earth processes, seasons, day and night, and so forth, were totally disrupted. And after the flood, God promises in chapter 8, verse 22, that he's not going to allow that to happen on a global scale again. The disruption of the seasons, as well as day and night, would also be expected under the CPT model. The cloud cover from both water and aerosols from the volcanic activity would have stopped day and night, blocked out sunlight, and with it summer and much of the heat that we receive. Now, obviously, seed time and harvest would be stopped while the earth was covered with water. And on the same day the waters began to decrease, the ark rested, it says, on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to recede for another 4 months. And during that period of recession, we know that the retreating floodwaters would have been catastrophically eroding many of Earth's canyons, though not all of them. We'll talk about Grand Canyon later. After 9 months, on the first day of the 10th month, Noah could see the tops of various mountains. After another 40 days, he sends out a raven and a dove, and then waited another week and sent the dove out again. And after it returned, he waited another week and sent the dove out, and the dove did not return. And then he waits another month and removes the covering from the ark, and he sees that the surface of the earth is dry. And he still, after that, waits another almost 2 months, and the earth had completely dried. They leave the ark. So the timeline as given in the text is based apparently on the Jewish calendar, which reckons time based on a lunar year, and that's actually 354 days total. So based on the text, about a year and 11 days passed, and when you convert that from the lunar to our solar calendar, we find from the beginning to the end, Noah and the other passengers left the ark after 1 solar year, exactly 365 days. Noah and his family, 8 people, exit the ark, and from those 8 people, repopulate the entire earth. And so you think about the genetic implications of that. Genetically, we all have a portion of Noah and a portion of his wife in our blood, regardless of our ethnicity. But it might not be only Noah and his wife's blood, because we don't know if the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth were also part of Noah's family. If they were sisters or cousins, then we would have 100% Noah and his wife's blood. But we don't know for sure. So if so, the portion of our genes that can be traced back to Noah either grows or gets smaller. But unless all 8 survivors were in Noah's family, we can be said to genetically be all from Noah and Miss Noah. Yeah, Noah and Miss Noah. So the passengers from the ark are found a completely different earth from the one that they experienced before the flood, right? Peter says that the world that then existed perished, and there's no doubt a lot more meaning than we typically might ascribe to that passage. This chart gives the lifespans of the patriarchs as recorded there in Genesis 5 and 11. So notice the approximate 900-year lifespan before the flood, with the exception of Enoch and Lamech. And then notice that the gradual drop in lifespans after the flood there, we've got an exponential decay. So keep in mind that this isn't a timeline per se. It's giving the actual age of each individual. It's generations, not timeline years, which would be more like the previous chart I showed with overlaps. And keep in mind that the Genesis 11 genealogies, which pick up after the flood, aren't quite as clear-cut as the Genesis 5 genealogies, and we'll talk about that briefly in a moment. But this seems to provide some evidence for the fact that apparently something was significantly different about the earth immediately after the flood occurred, likely in the environmental change. So apparently size, health, life longevity began to drop drastically, possibly in a proportional way to what was going on the earth as it gradually calmed down after the flood. And so creation scientists are still trying to figure out what in the world is going on there, what happened, what was so different on the earth, and in that how that would affect all the living creatures. And as further evidence of this major change that apparently occurred, Genesis 9, 2 and 3 says that the animals would begin to fear and dread humans, possibly indicating something different about the nature of animals as well. And then in verse 3, apparently linked with that statement about the animals, we have the first mention about God authorizing a carnivorous diet for humans, which would certainly lead to animals fearing us a little more. So again, whether or not some humans were already eating meat before this is unclear, but for sure God authorizes it here. It's also unclear as to whether at this point, it's at this point in which animals formally became carnivorous. Again, this isn't necessarily demanded by the text. We actually went this morning to that cave down the road, and I've drawn Russell Cave, is that what it's called, Russell Cave? And I thought that was interesting because that's depicting things that would have been really from this period. Their timeline's wrong, but we're talking about how life would have been in this early post-flood environment. So it's a pretty fascinating thing if you make the conversion in your mind from when they're talking about into the creation scale. That's what we're talking about. So you're imagining as people are spreading out and filling the earth, you're going to, of course, have a nomadic type behavior because they're not settling until they get spread out. And so they're basically following the herds. And then they finally get spread out and start putting down their roots, and then you would expect farming to start increasing at that point once they get spread out like God told them to be. I think that was fascinating to think about that. All right, so the rainbow begins to be used as a sign of God's covenant with earth to never again destroy the earth with water. Now, I was raised to think about this a little bit differently than it really might have been. You know, we might assume that this is the first time the rainbow makes its appearance on the earth, and I grew up thinking that. And we use it as even further proof of the vapor canopy idea, which postulates that there was no rain on the earth prior to this point. So this is the first time you see the rainbow. But again, you look closely at the text. We got to be careful to not say what the text does not come out and actually say. Many commentators recognize this fact about the rainbow and argue that the rainbow was already in existence before that, and that what's going on here is God is merely attaching significance to it, in the same way that he attached significance to, for example, the emblems of the Lord's Supper. Even though the apostles were already eating unleavened bread and drinking juice during the meal of Passover when it was instituted, he then attached significance to those things with regard to the Lord's Supper. So if there had already been rain on the earth, then there would have been rainbows with it. Those are an inevitable effect of rain and sunlight based on God's established laws of nature. So that said, even if there had been rainbows before the flood, there wouldn't have been one during the flood, because sunlight was being completely blocked by the heavy cloud cover and the volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere, so giving more evidence that the reappearance of the rainbow and sunlight after an entire year without it, that would have been extremely significant to Noah and his family. And God may have been merely attaching meaning and symbolism to the rainbow's appearance at that point, which then we all recognize and remember the flood because of that. So regardless, this is another place where we wouldn't want to be dogmatic where the text is not decisive. And this is something we have to be careful about in reading too much of the text. It's come back to bite us in some places whenever we've been dogmatic on some things that then we find out the science just doesn't work on this. So we've got to be real careful that we don't put words into God's mouth that he's not explicit about. And we try to be real careful about that. Now, another example of how different the world was after the flood is this ice age. We hardly even hear about this. We don't talk about this much in the church that I've seen. The ice age or the ice surge or the ice advance, depending on which creation scientist you talk to, we find a lot of evidence on the earth that a large portion of it was once covered with ice. In fact, 30% of the land, as opposed to just 10% today. So we can observe how glaciers move today and see the effects of that. And so from those observations, we can infer that the glaciers of the north used to extend down deep into the northern hemisphere. You see parallel striations or scratches on rocks that extend over miles and miles of plains from rocks and boulders and glaciers that were scratching rocks under glaciers as the glaciers moved. In some cases, faceting the rocks, just worn flat from the glacier movement. You see till and moraines that pile up along the edges of glaciers as they move. Secular geologists today believe that there were multiple ice ages over millions of years, sometimes as many as 50 ice ages. But they've got some major issues with their modern interpretation of the evidence for these ice ages. There has been no single theory that they've been able to come up with to explain the actual evidence. For example, why were all of the animal extinctions apparently only after the last ice age? You see 167 entire genera of the large mammals that are the big ones completely disappear from the earth. Why are all of these what we call disharmonious associations, where you have warm area animals like hippos that are mixing with the cold area animals like the woolly mammoths and the reindeer? Why is there evidence of deserts that used to be wet? And of course, the biggest issue that uniformitarians have, there's no known mechanism to initiate a single ice age, much less multiple ice ages. They don't even know how to start one. They can't figure out conditions to be able to even start one of these things. So how in the world would they even get started? Well, this is a place where the creation scientists have provided a solid answer to these problems. In fact, an ice age would be predicted to follow the flood based on the CPT model. It would be a necessary effect. So the modern creation science model theorizes that there weren't multiple ice ages. There was just one big one. and we call it more of an ice advance rather than an ice age, because they think that it was a gradual buildup that lasted at most probably 700 years, with a peak at around 500 years after the flood. So creation scientists would say that all of the evidence the secular meteorologists use to try to argue for ice ages over millions of years actually fits into a single major ice age that lasted for just a few hundred years. Okay, so what would be needed to start one of these ice ages? Well, we might be tempted to think, well, you just need colder winters. That would do it. But that would actually do the opposite, because with cold comes dryness, so you have less moisture. And that gets at the root of why the secular meteorologists can't figure out how to begin one of these things. The three basic ingredients that we understand are needed are cooler summers and more moisture, and then a persistence of these, all three of which would have been effects of the flood. So according to CPT, the volcanic activity in and after the flood would have shot ash and aerosols into the atmosphere and caused a lot of blockage of solar radiation, which would have cooled the summers. And that would have caused less melting during the summertime. So the ice would have continued to advance annually each winter in waves, eventually causing more and more extinctions, especially towards the end of this period. So the pre-flood environment was also likely warmer, including the ocean. And so then you got all this volcanic activity and tectonic activity in and after the flood. That would have heated up the ocean by several more degrees. So the result of that would have been much more evaporation of the seawater, leading to intense snowfall, especially in those areas away from the equator, since sun rays were halted by the aerosols and the ash. And so that's two of the ingredients. And the third ingredient is persistence. And we predict that the volcanic activity continued for some time after the flood. The oceans would have continued providing significantly elevated evaporation for possibly centuries until the earth calmed down and then things moved back towards an equilibrium state, at which time the ice would have begun to retreat. And towards the end of that period, catastrophic melting would be predicted to occur, which secular geologists have witnessed, with huge amounts of water forming in lakes and even in deserts. And there is evidence of that. And as the lakes grew from the melting, many of the natural dams that hold that water in these makeshift lakes would breach, and they caused the rapid formation of canyons. And this is a phenomenon observed to occur today when dams breach. The Lake Missoula flood, for example, is something you can actually Google. I think there's a YouTube documentary on that. This is known to have occurred due to the failure of a natural dam during an ice age, causing immense destruction. A 50-mile-long trench that was carved from 1 to 6 miles in width and with walls up to 900 feet high, carved out of solid rock. So geologists estimate that 10 cubic miles of basalt from the trench there at Lake Missoula was eroded rapidly by catastrophic flooding there at Lake Missoula. Grand Canyon is believed by creation scientists to have been formed in this manner during the ice advance period as well. Had an opportunity last summer to travel into the Grand Canyon by raft with a leading creation geologist to study the evidences of the rapid erosion of the flood during that ice age period. And so that's a whole other story, discussing about how the Grand Canyon was formed. I got a lot of material on that. It's really cool, but I hate to pass things up, but we have to. So the creationist, the ice advance theory may or may not be true. Again, it's a theory. It has great explanatory power where modern uniformitarian models fail to explain the evidence. It explains why there's this huge number of animal extinctions only at the end of the last ice age, because there's only one. It happened towards the end of that one ice age. It explains the disharmonious associations of the animals, because you've got milder winters and cooler summers, so that kept the animals relatively mixed. The evidence for the wet desert is explained by the flood and the post-flood evaporation and the rain and the glacier melting. You've got animal dispersions from Asia to America across the Bering Strait. That's explained because you've got more water in the form of ice and clouds and allowing access along the strait across these ice bridges that would have been in effect in the Ice Age period. You got the rapid formation of these post-flood canyons that don't take millions of years to form. They can happen rapidly in a major catastrophic breaching of an Ice Age dam. The thickness of the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica is explained. We'll talk about that tomorrow morning. And of course, the biggest plus is that we've got a clear-cut trigger to initiate the whole ice age. It's predicted, it's expected, we've got an answer, and they don't. And all the while this is going on, we step back from the science and we think about the fact that humanity is reproducing after the flood. They come off the ark, and this is what they're dealing with. So Genesis 10 and 11 gives genealogical information about these intervening centuries during what creation scientists theorize to be this ice advanced period. It helps us to see which line from Noah repopulated which areas of the world, but not much beyond that is known. Some argue that the mention of Peleg in the genealogies, this is a word which means divide. That coupled with the statement that the earth was divided in his days, they say, hey, then maybe that refers to the breaking up of Pangea and the plate tectonics we're talking about. But when you look at the context and we remove those chapter divisions, which again would have existed when Moses wrote the book, it makes much more sense that Peleg's name is just a reference to the division that took place when God divided the earth by language at the Tower of Babel. Now that said, while it is true that the division spoken of there in chapter 10 and verse 32 is clearly referring to the separation that God did at Babel, the underlying Hebrew word for divided there is different than the one used in verse 25, which means ditch, channel, or wadi. And it's used that way in Job 38:25. And so the division suggested by the breakup of Pangea would have certainly started as a channel or waterway. So anyway, something for creation scientists to keep in mind could support the CPT model. Adam Clark in his commentary argues that verse 5 is written anticipating the Peleg comment a few verses later. The isles of the nations were divided or separated. So they're divided lands there. So basically the countries accessible by sea, the coastland peoples were separated. So regardless if these verses are referring to the breakup of Pangea or not, continental movement could have still been pretty fast at this point based on the CPT model. Well, again, not much is explicitly stated about this period immediately after the flood. There's not really evidence of writing at all for some time. The Bible gives us genealogies for that period, from Seth to Abram, when there are 10 generations. Some try to argue that there could be gaps in these genealogies, even if there weren't any in Genesis 5, so missing individuals that he doesn't mention. So as evidence, they point to Luke 3:36, where Canaan is added to the genealogies as the son of Arphaxad. That's different from what is stated there in Genesis 10 and 11. Now it is true that the Hebrews didn't have a word for grandfather or grandson. They just had the word son. And so when referring to a grandson, they might sometimes say son's son, but sometimes they wouldn't. So we have to be careful, because sometimes they would say son, but mean an ancestor. It could be a grandson or a great-grandson and so forth. So son can be used more like descendant. And that's the basis of this argument with Canaan, that he was one of the descendants between Arphaxad and Salah. And so the idea is, well, maybe there's a bunch of these, and so you can work in millions of years here or something. It is, hopefully already you see that's a stretch. But in this case, you do a careful analysis of the evidence, and it indicates that Canaan was actually likely added as a scribal error sometime after Luke wrote this book, and that it shouldn't actually even be in there. So there's no solid evidence that the genealogies of Genesis 11 have any gaps. And there's no need for there to be gaps. And this is important, because the evidence from science and archaeology harmonizes with a short span of time between the flood and Abraham, as long as you take into account catastrophic activity. So that said, there might have been some wiggle room in chapter 11 in some of these genealogies in a different way. Recall from chapter 5 that Moses used this formula. Person X lived 8 years, and then person Y, and so forth. That's the formula there in Genesis 5. In Genesis 11, it's modified a little bit, and it eliminates the total age of the individual. And this seems to be important in order to reconcile some of the other statements you see in the text. You got to be careful making any assumptions whenever Moses did make a difference here in how he recorded this. So, for example, we got the total age of Noah, Terah, and Abram. They're given either here or in Genesis 5 or in surrounding chapters. But the others, that are highlighted in red are not given. Those total ages are not given. That is our own inferences about that. So we typically surmise that you can add the age to birth to the age after the son that's mentioned there in Genesis 11 and get a total age. And then we quickly add up the time between the flood and Peleg to figure out how much time passed between the flood, the approximate time of Babel or whatever, and figure it somewhere around a century after the flood. Now that doesn't necessarily work in this case for a couple reasons. So take, for example, Abram. The text says that Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran when he was 70. Okay, so were they triplets? No, the text doesn't seem to be saying that. Genesis says that Abram left Haran when Haran was 75. And so we can do some math here quickly. If Abram was actually born when Terah was 70, then we have 75, we add 75 to 70 and infer that Abram left Haran when Terah was 145. Terah then dies at 205, Genesis 11:32. Now wait a minute, because in Acts 7:4, Stephen, who's inspired by the Holy Spirit, says that Abram did not leave Haran to go to Palestine until after Terah died, which would mean that there's a 60-year discrepancy between the Genesis account and Stephen's account in Acts chapter 7 and verse 4, and we would have a problem. Another example, Genesis 5 says that Noah was 500 when he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So again, did he have triplets? Apparently not, because when you do the math, we see that Shem was technically born when Noah was 503. Noah was 600 when the floods came, 601 when it ended, and then Shem had Arphaxad 2 years after the flood when he was 100 years old. So that would mean that would have made Noah 603 when Shem was 100. So if Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born as triplets when Noah was 500, then Shem couldn't have been 100 when he begot Arphaxad. Right? A lot of math there. So he should have been 103. So how do you reconcile all of these apparent discrepancies? Well, by understanding that the Hebrews could emphasize different things. They emphasize different things than we do today in some cases. So apparently, when Moses was giving the first number on this chart, the age at which the patriarchs had a son, that number is the age at which the firstborn son was born, what Moses calls the beginning of strength, as he calls it in Genesis 49:3 and Deuteronomy 21:17. The specific son that is named in the genealogy, however, is not necessarily the firstborn son. Now that explains why Shem is emphasized, even though he apparently wasn't the oldest. Ham is called the youngest in Genesis 9:24, and Japheth is said to be the oldest in Genesis 10:21, so Shem was in between. So apparently Noah lived 500 years and had Japheth, then Shem later, then Ham. So understanding this practice by Moses, that the first number in the Genesis 11 genealogy is apparently when the firstborn was born, but not necessarily when the son who's mentioned was born, that understanding leaves some room for a few years to be added between the firstborn and the specific son that's mentioned, except in those cases when the son that is mentioned happens to be the firstborn, if that makes sense. Now, why in the world would Moses mention the names he's mentioning in the list instead of just listing the firstborn? Well, because all of this is leading up to Abram, and he's the significant one we're moving to. We're reading about Abram's ancestry. It's Abram's lineage that Moses is interested in telling us about. And so he doesn't waste words telling more about the other lineages that aren't as relevant to his story. So whichever names were in Abram's lineage, that was the ones that he was homing in on by name. So this would mean that what Moses meant in Genesis 11:26, and possibly in the other cases in Genesis 11, using modern thinking and terminology, Moses could have been saying, now Terah lived 70 years and then began having sons, the most important of whom was Abram because of the messianic link. So this explains this apparent discrepancy regarding Stephen's statements. Abram wasn't born when Terah was 70, but some 60 years later, when he was around 130 years old, resolving that discrepancy. Now, how is that important from a scientific perspective? Well, the implication scientifically is that we can't nail down precisely when the flood was or the creation because of the ancient way of thinking in this matter. So the flood could have been anywhere between 2350 BC and a few centuries before that, and the creation would then be offset slightly as well. A few centuries possibly beyond that, which is why we generally say that creation was 6,000 to 8,000 years old. And you can pretty much figure out an upper limit. There's no tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years to work with here. We're talking about a few hundred years that they would have to work with, which is not going to help with secular geology by any means. All right, now, we got some material on our website that goes more into depth into that if you want to study that some more, because I know I had to fly through the math, but we got some material. Let me know if you're interested in that. I'll try to find those articles for you. All right, the last thing I want to talk about, we move forward into Babel, which could have been as early as 100 years after the flood, or a few decades later, and this would fall during, again, the period of the Ice Age, the Ice Advance, according to the CPT model, which might help explain humanity's reluctance to obey God and spread out, or why God chose to step in when he did, to make sure that the spreading happened before the conditions of the Ice Age prevented passage to remote areas, or before the Ice Age was over and would have eliminated any of the ice bridges and so forth. So the Ice Age could have been playing a role here. So regardless, we know that the Earth apparently initially spoke one language for at least 1,700 years. We have to be careful about making too many assumptions about that. We know at this point the language divisions are officially created for the first time, at least post-flood, and the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth spread out from Palestine. And one final point that we have to keep in mind as creation scientists about historical science, there's more than just worldwide catastrophic events that we have to take into account, isn't there? Aren't there a lot of things that happened in the Bible, miraculous events which could have really caused a rapid appearance of age that only happened locally and quickly? You got Sodom and Gomorrah, but you think about the plagues that hit Egypt. You've got this fiery hailstorm. You've got tectonic activity where God will just open up the ground and remember, poor Dathan and Abiram and families get swallowed up. I mean, that's a major event that happened that creation scientists have to keep in mind. So for example, 2 years ago, I had planned on going over to Jordan with the creation geologist. He's out there studying some sediment at the Dead Sea, and he's correlating biblical events with earthquake activity over there as he's digging down into the Dead Sea sediment. You dig down and you can see that the levels that are laid down each year of material that's laid down at the Dead Sea. And any time there is an earthquake, there's what's called a seismite. Basically, the level the sediment layer is jiggled. And so you can count these and actually correlate biblical events where an earthquake is mentioned and actually correlate it with what's going on there at the Dead Sea. So he's been able to correlate the earthquakes at the time of Christ that are mentioned. There's actually, you got the earthquake that happened when Jesus died, but then also an earthquake that happened whenever the stone was rolled away and so forth, or I don't remember the details of that one. It seems like there was another one also in that same year as well. You go back a few hundred years before that, there's another one mentioned in the Old Testament. You go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, you might expect a seismite there. So he's digging down trying to find these, how you can actually correlate biblical events. Pretty fascinating thing. So we're trying to keep that in mind. We've got to keep in mind biblical catastrophic events that would have correlated to what you find in science. All right, pretty fascinating stuff. I hope you're seeing how much neat stuff that we can draw from looking at the text and looking at the evidence that God has left us on the earth, and we find that it harmonizes and gives us a much bigger picture of the works of the Lord as He has worked those over the years. All right, a couple things here. If you're not aware, we have a Vacation Bible School. Actually, we have two of those. This one's on God's creation, and we've got one that is on the Bible, and how we got the Bible, and the Bible is from God. This has been used by hundreds of congregations. Make sure you're aware of those. And also, if you're not aware of our Bible class curriculum that we have available, it's for ages 2 through grade 6. Ages 2 through grade 4 is free. It's just all online. You just go download it, use it. We've got activities, a lot of times songs. We always have songs to go to each lesson. Some of the songs are specifically written for certain lessons. This isn't just Christian evidence, this is a journey through the Bible. So ages 2 through 5, you go through the Bible in 4 years and then you repeat it at a slightly more advanced level. So it's an 8-year curriculum, and then 2 years are tagged on at the end, which is our Explorer series, which is, we print that, so you have to purchase that. But the rest of it is just available for free online. So make sure you're aware of that. It's being used by many people, including a lot of denominational churches, believe it or not, are using this curriculum, which we're pretty excited about that, especially whenever they get to the Acts 2 material. That's kind of particularly exciting. Hundreds and hundreds of congregations are using that as well. Also make sure that you're aware of our advanced Bible reader for kids. This is a way to motivate them to read the Bible and also other spiritual type materials. We've got, what they do is they read a section of scripture, like Genesis 1 through 5. And after they read it, they go take a little test, a little quiz that tests their knowledge of that section. They get points. And so they get a gradual build-up of points, and after they get 100 points, the parent there's nice certificates you can print off for them, or if you do it as a congregation as a whole for the kids, the elders can present a child with a certificate once they get to a certain marker and so forth. And so at the same time, they're competing against other kids all over the world that are doing this, to try to get points for reading the Bible and for retaining the material, as well as these other Christian evidences materials that we have available. Also be aware that we have Christian evidences camps each summer, 2 of those, and those are extremely popular. I mean, they fill up pretty quick. But be aware that we have those. The idea is, kids get out of a year of school where they're learning naturalism, and this gives them an opportunity to have apologetics material to prepare them for the next year over a week. It's a lot of material that we try to present them. There's a big emphasis on teaching material at this camp than there is at a lot of other summer camps that I've seen. Although there still is a lot of time they have to play and do other things. All right. My mouth feels like mush, even if your brain doesn't. I appreciate very much your attention. I hope you see the value in this stuff, what we're trying to do. We're trying to answer the charges that are being levied against us. And so what we've done at this point is we've laid out the biblical creation model as modern creation science sees it. And so in the next 2 sessions, we'll look at charges that are made against it to see if it can withstand scrutiny. And what you find is it adds even more amazing evidence for the biblical model. So it just gets more fun from there. Thank you very much for sticking with me, and let me know if you have any questions about materials or questions about this material or the material back there. Be sure to come up and let me know. All right, I am finished, unless you got an announcement to make.